In the heart of the city, amidst the noisy chaos of an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the old man entered the cafe with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the rise and fall of empires, the blooming and withering of 1,000 summers. His appearance was the first thing people noticed, followed closely by the faint hum of confusion that seemed to settle around him like a fog. He wore a tattered robe, something out of a storybook, and his beard flowed down to his chest like the white crest of a waterfall, despite the youthful glint in his deep, knowing eyes. The cafe was bustling with the regular lunch crowd, but when he entered, it was as though time had hit pause for just a moment. The barista, a young woman with brightly colored hair, did a double take before returning to her work, trying not to seem too intrigued. The elder, as he was known, had lived for more centuries than most could count. His very name was a riddle in itself, for no one truly knew his age. Some said he was a relic of ancient times, others believed him to be an immortal spirit, walking the earth in search of knowledge, and others still thought he was simply a madman lost in the depths of history. But whatever he was, the moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere in the cafe changed. "One black coffee, please," he said softly, his voice smooth and weathered like the pages of a book that had been read one too many times. His accent was strange, neither here nor there, but it carried with it a gravitas that made even the most distracted customer stop to listen. "Sure," the barista replied, snapping back to her senses. She hesitated for a second, noticing the strange glow in his eyes. The elder, however, didn't seem to notice her stares. He simply took a seat by the window, looking out at the city streets with an inscrutable expression. As the barista prepared his coffee, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward the old man. She caught herself sneaking glances at him from behind the counter. His presence made her feel as if she was caught between moments in time. As if, just by being near him, she could somehow sense the faint whispers of the past, laughter, sighs, secrets that had long since faded into dust. A few minutes passed, and the elder's coffee was ready. But when the barista handed him the cup, something unexpected happened. The moment his fingers brushed the warm ceramic, the world around him seemed to shudder, as if a ripple had passed through reality itself. The cafe, the bustling street outside, everything, faded away. In the blink of an eye, the elder was standing on a cobblestone street, somewhere far removed from the present. The air smelled different, mustier, older. The sounds of automobiles and city life were replaced by the chatter of people in fine clothes, walking briskly down the narrow streets of what seemed to be the 1920s. The cafe had vanished, replaced by a small newsstand that seemed utterly out of place. The elder blinked, his mind racing. It was as if he'd stepped into a different time altogether. "Excuse me, sir," a man in a pinstriped suit passed him by, not even noticing his presence. The elder's brows furrowed. Something was terribly wrong. He snapped his fingers, and the scene evaporated like a mirage. He was back in the cafe. The world had righted itself. "Well, that was certainly unexpected," the elder muttered, staring at the cup in his hands. The barista, now looking at him with wide eyes, apologized profusely for the mix-up, handing him another coffee. But the elder wasn't paying attention to the girl. His mind was elsewhere, deep in thought. There had been a momentary crack in time. A fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there, a gap, an anomaly. He had felt it before, in his long years of existence, but this time, the sensation was different. He knew that it wasn't just some fleeting glitch. It was a clue, an indication that something much larger than a mere accident was at play. The blank year. That was what the elder had been chasing for decades, and the fleeting anomaly in the cafe was a signal. Something, or someone, had tampered with time, stealing an entire year from the timeline. For centuries, the elder had been searching for this missing piece, the year that had vanished from the history books, as if it never existed. The historians had their theories, the conspiracy theorists their own, but only a few knew the truth. Time could be stolen in a way that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. And there was only one person in the world who could do that, the time merchant, as his name suggested, wasn't just a figure from folklore. He was very much real, alive, thriving, and manipulating the very essence of time itself. He had discovered a way to steal moments, whole stretches of time, from history, and in doing so, he had learned to extend his own life, ensuring he would never age, never die, as long as the stolen time remained his to keep. Time, in his hands, became a commodity, a currency he could trade for power, wealth, and influence. And in the process, he had managed to wipe clean entire segments of history, erasing them from the collective memory of mankind. The blank year was one such theft. It was a time lost to the ages, an entire year that had never existed, except for the few who could remember it. Few people would ever realize it was gone, but the elder had seen the cracks, the subtle discrepancies in the records of time. His ancient mind had traced the disruptions back to the time merchant, a figure who had spent decades subtly erasing moments from history to fuel his own power. The elder had spent years tracking the time merchant, moving through different periods and places, following the threads of history that had been twisted and distorted. He had gathered information from old scholars, mystics, and time walkers who shared his knowledge, but it was never enough. The time merchant was too clever, too powerful to be caught easily. The elder knew that the only way to undo the damage done by the time merchant was to find and return the missing year. If he could do that, he could break the time merchant's hold over the flow of time and return balance to the universe. The stolen year was the key, but finding it wouldn't be easy. Later that evening, the elder found himself in a quiet alley, standing before an unassuming bookstore nestled between two grand buildings. The sign hanging above the door read simply, "The Timekeeper's Nook." He could sense the pull of ancient knowledge emanating from within. This was no ordinary store, it was a place where time itself seemed to pause, a nexus where those who knew of the secret histories gathered to exchange stories, information, and relics. The door creaked open, and the musty smell of old paper and ink filled his nostrils. Inside, a young man sat behind a desk, his eyes barely lifting from a stack of yellowed manuscripts. The elder's gaze flickered over the shelves, where time-worn books rested, their titles written in forgotten languages. He had been here before, but tonight, something felt different. The young man looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You're here about the year, aren't you?" The elder nodded. "I know where to find it," the young man said, his voice low and cautious. "But you'll need to be careful. The time merchant has eyes everywhere." "I've been careful for centuries," the elder replied, his voice calm yet tinged with the weight of experience. "Now, it's time to end this." As the elder left the bookstore, a storm of thoughts swirled in his mind. The blank year was real, and the time merchant had hidden it away, obscured it from the world. The key to restoring history, to setting everything right again, was within reach. But the danger was greater than he had imagined. The time merchant was always a step ahead. The elder would have to outwit him, not just in the realm of time, but in the game of minds. But the time for hesitation was over. The hunt had begun, the night deepened, but the elder's mind was wide awake, consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead. The city around him was like an intricate web of time, each street, each person, a tiny thread in the vast, interconnected tapestry that spanned the centuries. The time merchant had learned to weave through this web, to cut away pieces of history like an artist discarding unwanted scraps. The elder, however, had seen enough of the world to know that even the most carefully constructed illusion could be unraveled with patience and wit. And he had patience in abundance. His steps carried him through the city's winding streets, the echoes of his boots lost in the symphony of distant traffic and faint chatter. He passed by alleyways where memories seemed to cling to the bricks, remnants of the past mingling with the present. For the elder, time wasn't just a series of moments strung together, it was a living thing, a force he could see and touch if he concentrated long enough. That's why he could feel the distortions, the subtle rips in the fabric of reality. The time merchant had left his mark, and now it was up to the elder to find it. His destination was a forgotten building on the outskirts of the city, a crumbling structure that had once been a mansion but now stood as little more than a shadow of its former self. The windows were dark, the walls cracked and faded. No one lived there anymore, but the elder knew that the mansion held something important, something that could give him the final clue to locate the stolen year. As he approached the front door, it swung open without a sound. He didn't flinch. He had grown used to this kind of thing over the centuries. In the time-bent world he inhabited, doors opened on their own accord, time itself bending to the whims of the few who knew how to manipulate it. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The walls were lined with forgotten artifacts, paintings, old furniture, and curious trinkets from bygone eras. But it wasn't any of these things that had drawn the elder here. It was the faint hum of power in the air, the same hum that told him the time merchant's influence had been at work. The room at the end of the hallway was where he needed to go. The door, though aged, wasn't locked. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the subtle shift in the air, the way time seemed to bend and warp around him. This room, more than any other in the mansion, held a piece of the puzzle. At the center of the room stood a tall, ornate mirror, its surface gleaming despite the dust surrounding it. The elder approached cautiously, knowing that nothing was ever as simple as it appeared. The mirror, in its stillness, held the secrets he sought. He placed his hand against the cold glass, feeling the vibrations of distant times shifting beneath his touch. With a soft sigh, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to connect to the mirror's magic. For a moment, the world fell away. The room disappeared, replaced by flashes of images, fragmented moments from the blank year, jumbled together in chaotic bursts. He saw glimpses of people he didn't recognize, places that never existed in the present timeline. The images flickered, distorted by the time merchant's meddling, but they were enough to guide him. A name. A place. A secret buried within the year itself. It was all here, hidden beneath layers of time. The vision ended as quickly as it had started, and the elder pulled his hand away, blinking against the sudden disorientation. The room around him came back into focus, and he could feel the weight of the knowledge he had just gained. The blank year wasn't just a moment erased from history, it was an entire pocket of time, sealed away and hidden in a place untouched by the present. The key to unlocking it was tied to the time merchant's past, his very origins. The elder had always suspected that the time merchant's abilities were not a mere accident, not some chance discovery of a hidden power. No, the time merchant had been involved with something far darker, something that involved the very fabric of time itself, an ancient secret buried deep in the past. With this new revelation in mind, the elder knew his next step. He had to find the time merchant, confront him, and uncover the final piece of the puzzle. But the journey ahead would not be easy. The time merchant had grown far more powerful over the years, and his control over time had become nearly absolute. Even now, the elder could feel the shifting tides of time, as if the very flow of history was bending in response to the merchant's machinations. The battle to reclaim the blank year would be one of wits, of careful manipulation, and of timing, something that the elder had in abundance. The next morning, the elder set out once more. The city felt different now, as if something had shifted overnight. There was an unease in the air, a sense that the world was holding its breath. The elder knew that the time merchant was aware of his presence. The merchant always knew. His path took him to a more secluded part of the city, far from the crowds and the noise of the modern world. Here, in the quiet, the buildings seemed to stretch upward, their facades ancient and weathered, like sentinels from another time. The streets were deserted, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. It was here, in the shadows of forgotten history, that the elder would find the answers he sought. He entered a small, unassuming building at the corner of a narrow street, a place that seemed to blend into its surroundings. Inside, the atmosphere was completely different. The air smelled of ink and parchment, of age-old wisdom waiting to be uncovered. The room was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. At a table in the center of the room sat a man who was nothing like the time merchant, and yet, the elder knew immediately that he was one of the merchant's agents, a person who knew too much and whose allegiance lay with the dark forces manipulating the very course of time. The man was sitting calmly, flipping through a stack of yellow documents, as if waiting for the elder to arrive. "I've been expecting you," the man said, his voice cold and calculated. He didn't look up from his papers. The elder didn't respond at first. Instead, he studied the man carefully, his sharp eyes noticing the subtle details, how the man's hands were perfectly steady, how his eyes never moved, as though he were waiting for something beyond the moment. The elder had seen such things before in those who dabbled with time, in those who knew the power it held. "Tell me where he is," the elder finally said, his voice low but filled with authority. "Tell me, and perhaps I'll spare you from the consequences of your involvement." The man finally lifted his gaze, meeting the elder's eyes with an unreadable expression. "You think you can stop him? You're too late, elder. Time has already been rewritten. The blank year is gone, lost forever." "No," the elder said, his voice firm. "It's only lost if you allow it to be. And I won't allow it." A silence settled over the room, thick with tension. The man's expression remained unchanged, but the air between them seemed to crackle with the weight of their words. "You'll never find him," the man finally spoke, his voice softer now. "The time merchant doesn't exist in any one place anymore. He's spread across the flow of time itself." The elder stood still, his mind working over the words. It was exactly what he had suspected. The time merchant had transcended the boundaries of the physical world. He was no longer confined to a single point in space. He was everywhere, and nowhere. "The blank year," the elder muttered, mostly to himself. "It's not just a time lost. It's a doorway." The man's eyes flickered, a faint glimmer of fear passing through them. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know more than you think," the elder replied, turning and walking toward the door. "And I'm coming for him." The rest of the day passed in a blur. The elder's mind was a whirlwind of thought, each new realization taking him closer to the truth. The time merchant wasn't just manipulating time, he was using it as a weapon, as a shield, as a tool to reshape the very world around him. The blank year was no longer a mere anomaly, it was the key to undoing everything the time merchant had built. Night fell, and the elder found himself standing before a grand, imposing structure, the headquarters of the time merchant. It was here, in this fortress of time, that the final battle would take place. The elder could feel the presence of the time merchant even before he entered, as if the very walls were alive with the merchant's energy. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. This was it, the end of the line. The blank year would be restored, and the time merchant's reign would come to an end. But the elder knew that victory would not come easily. Time was a fickle ally, and even the smallest misstep could lead to disaster. With one final glance at the sky, the elder stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay beyond.